In the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at the height of its power. From the shores of China to the jungles of Southeast Asia, the rising sun flag flew over vast territories conquered in only a few months. After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had crippled much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The world watched as Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with lightning precision. To many inside the empire, it seemed unstoppable, a nation of samurai reborn through modern steel and discipline. But behind the victories, one man knew that time was not on Japan's side. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Navy. A graduate of Harvard and former naval attaché in Washington, Yamamoto understood America's industrial strength. He once warned, "For 6 months after the start of hostilities, I can run wild. But I have no expectation of success in a long war." Still, he believed a decisive battle could change history. One overwhelming blow that would destroy America's remaining carriers and force the United States to negotiate peace. That plan would unfold around a tiny coral atoll halfway between Asia and North America, Midway Island. The plan, Yamamoto's idea, was bold, even elegant. The Japanese fleet would attack Midway to lure out what remained of the U.S. carriers. While a main force struck from the west, a separate group waited to ambush any American ships that came to defend the island. If successful, the Pacific would belong entirely to Japan. The operation involved 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each carrying about 70 planes. Together they formed the heart of what Japan called the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval air force the world had ever seen. Their crews were veterans of Pearl Harbor, trained with unmatched discipline and loyalty to the Emperor. On the decks, mechanics worked under the morning sun, loading torpedoes and inspecting aircraft engines. Pilots practiced formation takeoffs, their white headbands fluttering in the wind. In their journals, many wrote not of glory, but of duty. "If I fall," one pilot wrote, "may my spirit protect Japan." At sea, the atmosphere was calm, almost serene. Mess halls served rice and miso soup as loudspeakers played sentimental songs about home. Thousands of sailors believed they were sailing toward the battle that would secure peace for generations. "We felt pride," a surviving officer would later recall, "and an unspoken fear. The ocean was endless, and somewhere beyond that horizon, the Americans were waiting." A calculated confidence. To Japanese planners, the odds seemed certain. They assumed the enemy had only 2 or 3 carriers left, too few to oppose them. Intelligence reports suggested American morale was low after months of defeats. Even the weather seemed favorable: calm seas, clear skies, perfect for carrier operations. Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, sailed behind the carriers as a reserve force, a symbol of the Empire's might. A fleet of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines spread across thousands of miles of ocean. It was the most complex naval operation Japan had ever attempted. From Tokyo to Truk Lagoon, confidence filled the air. The newspapers promised another triumph. Posters urged citizens to work harder for victory in Midway. Even children practiced air raid drills, while their parents whispered prayers for sons and brothers serving at sea. No one aboard the ships knew that far across the ocean, American cryptanalysts had already broken Japan's secret naval code, and that the U.S. Navy was quietly preparing a trap of its own. But on those calm May mornings of 1942, the men of the Kido Butai could not imagine defeat. The horizon was clear, the sea gentle, and the red sun reflected perfectly on the water, a mirror of their faith in destiny. "We believed," the narrator concludes, "that the Emperor's navy would decide the war in one stroke. None of us knew that we were sailing toward the storm that would change Japan forever." The Japanese fleet advanced across the vast Pacific, moving with the precision of a single organism. Every sailor knew his place, every pilot his purpose. Orders flowed from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's headquarters through miles of ocean cables and coded messages. To them, secrecy was absolute. Their communications used the complex naval cipher JN-25, believed to be unbreakable. Every coordinate, every operation name, every target was disguised beneath layers of numbers and code books. The Japanese command trusted it completely. Yet, far across the ocean, in a nondescript building on the island of Oahu, a small group of American intelligence officers worked tirelessly to decode that very system. They called themselves Station Hypo. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was a quiet, intense man who often wore a smoking robe instead of a uniform. Around him, linguists and mathematicians deciphered fragments of Japanese transmissions day and night. Each piece was like a fragment of glass, meaningless on its own, but together forming a pattern. Slowly, painfully, they began to see what Yamamoto was planning. By May of 1942, Rochefort's team intercepted repeated references to a location called AF. No one knew what AF meant. Some thought it might be a code for Hawaii, others for the Aleutian Islands, but the analysts at Station Hypo had a suspicion. AF was Midway. To prove it, they devised a clever ruse. The American base on Midway sent an open, unencrypted message reporting that its fresh water system had broken. 2 days later, the Japanese radio network transmitted a secret message stating, "AF reports shortage of water." The trap worked. AF was confirmed. The Japanese were coming for Midway. Back in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, faced a decision. The American Navy still licked its wounds from Pearl Harbor with only 3 carriers operational: Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown. They were outnumbered, but now they had something Japan did not: foreknowledge. Nimitz decided to gamble everything. He positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, just beyond Japan's expected scouting range. His plan was simple, but daring. Let the Japanese strike first, reveal their position, and then launch a surprise counterattack. The Japanese, unaware their secret had been exposed, continued toward Midway with full confidence. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier force, the same man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was a cautious and methodical officer, trusted by Yamamoto, but burdened by indecision. His fleet sailed in 4 great formations, hundreds of aircraft ready to be launched at dawn on June 4th. Around him, sailors polished brass instruments, mechanics tuned aircraft engines, and priests performed small Shinto blessings for the mission's success. They believed the Americans were still recovering, their morale shattered. On June 3rd, Japanese reconnaissance planes spotted no American ships. The path seemed clear. The calm waters reflected the red insignia of the rising sun, painted on the aircraft wings. Officers spoke quietly of destiny. "The gods favor the Empire," one said, as messages of encouragement arrived from Tokyo. The operation was running smoothly. The enemy would be caught by surprise, just as at Pearl Harbor, but beneath that surface of confidence, fate was already shifting. Far to the northeast, American carriers floated silently on the horizon, hidden by clouds and distance. Their pilots, briefed in secret, waited inside dimly lit ready rooms. They knew what was coming. The Americans had practiced the timing, the attack angles, even the fuel calculations for the strike they would soon launch. It would not be an ambush by Japan this time. It would be a duel of timing, courage, and intelligence. As the Japanese fleet closed in, the illusion of invincibility remained intact. They had no idea the enemy already knew their target, their routes, and even the hour of their planned assault. Yamamoto's masterpiece of deception had been turned against him. The Empire's most powerful fleet was sailing into a trap it could not see. The calm ocean gave no hint of danger. The air was clear, the morning quiet. To the men aboard the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, it was simply another day in the service of the Emperor. No one among them imagined that within 48 hours the name Midway would become a scar in the history of Japan, and the moment when the tide of the Pacific would begin to turn. The first light of June 4th, 1942, crept over the horizon of the Pacific Ocean. The sea was calm, the sky pale and cloudless. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the air hummed with the rhythm of engines warming and the shouts of deck crews preparing for launch. On the flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge, watching the flight deck bustle with movement. He knew that within minutes his planes would strike the small American outpost on Midway Atoll. If all went as planned, this day would break the back of American resistance in the Pacific. At 4:30 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off. Bombers, dive bombers, and fighters roared into the sky, climbing eastward toward Midway, more than 200 miles away. The mission was led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's successor, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, a skilled aviator and respected officer. The Japanese airmen were calm and disciplined, their training the finest in the world. They believed that by sunset, the island would be in flames, and the Americans, too, battered to respond. On the decks below, mechanics refueled the reserve planes and reloaded torpedoes for a second wave in case another strike was needed. Hours before the Japanese attack force reached its target, American radar operators on Midway detected their approach. Sirens wailed across the atoll as Marines and Navy personnel rushed to defensive positions. Fighters scrambled to meet the incoming formation. The island's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the first bombs fell. Japanese pilots, flying in tight formation, released their payloads with precision. Explosions tore through the small airfields, destroying fuel tanks and hangars. Smoke rose high into the sky, visible even to the distant Japanese fleet. From Nagumo's bridge, spotters confirmed the attack's success. Midway was burning. But the Americans fought back with everything they had. Their anti-aircraft fire was fierce, forcing some Japanese planes to swerve or abort their runs. A few were shot down into the sea. The defending pilots, outnumbered and outgunned, launched desperate counterattacks. Though most were destroyed, they managed to disrupt the bombing runs and scatter the formations. When the Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers, many were damaged, and some pilots reported that the island's defenses remained operational. It was not the clean victory Nagumo had expected. Now he faced a difficult decision. His original plan had been to hold part of his air group in reserve, armed with torpedoes, in case American ships appeared. But after receiving the reports that Midway was still standing, he ordered those reserve planes to be rearmed with bombs for another strike against the island. Below deck, the crews began the complex and dangerous process of replacing torpedoes with bombs. Fuel lines ran across the hangars, and live munitions were stacked beside the aircraft, the smell of gasoline mixed with the salt air. Every man worked quickly but carefully, aware that one mistake could ignite the entire ship. While Nagumo's fleet was focused on rearming, American reconnaissance planes from Midway spotted the Japanese carriers. They radioed their position to the American fleet, waiting hundreds of miles away. At 7 a.m., waves of U.S. bombers and torpedo planes took off from Midway and from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. They flew at low altitude, braving anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Most never returned. Dozens of American planes were shot down without scoring a single hit. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. They kept the Japanese defenses occupied, forcing Nagumo to delay his second strike and keeping his decks full of fully fueled aircraft. The timing could not have been worse for Japan. At 7:28, Nagumo received an urgent message from one of his scout planes. Enemy ships had been sighted to the northeast. It was the confirmation he had both feared and expected. American carriers were nearby. He instantly cancelled the planned second attack on Midway and ordered his crews to rearm the planes again, this time back to torpedoes to engage the U.S. fleet. Below deck, chaos erupted. Bombs and torpedoes were shuffled in tight spaces, planes were moved by hand, and fuel lines were hastily disconnected and reattached. The flight decks became a maze of danger. The minutes dragged into hours. By late morning, Nagumo's carriers were caught in a fragile moment, with aircraft half-fueled, weapons scattered, and defensive fighters low on fuel. Pilots waited in the cockpits, ready to launch, while mechanics wiped sweat from their faces. No one realized that far above the clouds, unseen by the Japanese, squadrons of American dive bombers were already approaching. The fate of the Imperial Navy hung in a balance so fine that a few minutes, even seconds, would determine history. The men aboard the Japanese carriers felt a sense of control, of calm, before what they assumed would be another victory. They could not know that the ocean beneath them was about to erupt in fire and that the Empire's proudest fleet stood on the edge of disaster. The sky above Midway, once clear and bright, was about to fill with smoke, steel, and destiny. Late in the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Pacific seemed deceptively peaceful. On the bridges of the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the officers scanned the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The air was still, the ocean like glass. Yet above those calm waters, American aircraft were closing in. Their flight had been long and exhausting, nearly running out of fuel, but their timing was perfect. Guided by a combination of luck, determination, and partial radio reports, they had found the Japanese fleet just as it was most vulnerable. Below deck, Japanese crews were still rearming aircraft when the first alarm sounded. Lookouts spotted distant shapes in the sky, American planes diving from the sun. Shouts of "Enemy aircraft!" echoed across the ships. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, their tracers arcing upward. The sky erupted in thunder. The Americans attacking were dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown, flying the rugged Douglas SBD Dauntless. They had arrived at the exact moment when the Japanese decks were crowded with fueled planes, bombs, and torpedoes. It was the worst possible situation for the Imperial Navy. The lead American squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had nearly turned back after failing to locate the Japanese fleet. Then, spotting a lone Japanese destroyer speeding north, McCluskey decided to follow its wake. That decision led him straight to the heart of the Japanese formation. At 10:22 a.m., the Dauntless dive bombers broke through the clouds and began their attack. They dove steeply from nearly 20,000 feet, their sirens screaming, sunlight flashing off their wings. The Japanese fighters, exhausted from earlier engagements, were caught off guard and unable to climb in time to intercept them. On the Kaga, sailors barely had time to react. The first bombs struck amidships, piercing the flight deck and exploding among the planes being refueled. A chain of explosions followed, ripping through the hangar levels. Flames engulfed the ship instantly, black smoke rising high into the sky. Nearby, the Akagi was hit by a single devastating bomb that ignited a massive fire near the command bridge. Captain Taijiro Aoki tried desperately to contain the damage, but it was too late. Within minutes, the ship was a burning inferno. Officers gave the order to abandon ship as the heat became unbearable. The Soryu was struck next. 3 bombs tore through her decks, detonating among armed torpedoes and gasoline. The blast lifted aircraft off the deck and sent them spinning into the sea. Pilots and deck crews jumped overboard to escape the flames. The once proud carrier began to list to one side, engulfed in black smoke. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were fatally damaged. The Imperial Navy's air power, the same force that had struck Pearl Harbor, was being wiped out in a matter of minutes. Admiral Nagumo, watching from the bridge of the Akagi, was stunned. The speed of the destruction defied belief. He had prepared for an orderly battle between fleets, not an inferno from the sky. The enemy's attack had come with surgical precision at the very moment his own planes were defenseless. Messages of chaos filled the radios. Fire on the flight deck. Fuel tanks exploding. Abandoned ship. The noise of secondary explosions drowned out communication. The sea was soon covered with burning debris, lifeboats, and men struggling in oil-stained water. Yet even in disaster, discipline remained. Crewmen helped one another into rafts, saluting their captains before jumping into the ocean. Some continued to fight the fires despite overwhelming heat. Others refused to leave their posts. For many, it was not just a battle, but a test of loyalty and honor. The flames reflected on the water like molten gold, the rising smoke marking the turning point of the Pacific War. Only one carrier remained operational, the Hiryu. Under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, it prepared a desperate counterattack. Yamaguchi, a man of courage and resolve, refused to retreat. He ordered every available aircraft launched against the American fleet. 2 waves of bombers roared into the sky, striking the carrier Yorktown with enough force to halt its operations temporarily. But the Americans quickly repaired the damage, and their scouts soon located Hiryu's position. That afternoon, American dive bombers returned, striking the last Japanese carrier with precision. Flames consumed her decks just as they had the others. As night fell, the sea glowed with the light of burning ships. The remaining Japanese vessels began retreating westward. Admiral Yamamoto, far behind the main force, received word of the catastrophe. His plan for a decisive victory had ended in disaster. 4 carriers, more than 300 aircraft, and many of Japan's finest aviators were gone. The Empire's naval strength, built over decades, had been shattered in one day. The calm Pacific now reflected only the fire of defeat. For the men who survived, the images of that morning would never fade. The screams, the explosions, the sight of proud ships dying beneath the sun, all became part of Japan's collective memory. The Battle of Midway had lasted only a few hours, but it changed the balance of the world's oceans. The rising sun still flew over many territories, but its light had begun to dim. The ocean that once carried Japan's power now carried the ashes of its pride. The night of June 4th fell heavy over the ocean. The flames that had consumed the Japanese carriers burned far into the darkness, their glow visible for miles. Sailors floated in the black water, clinging to wreckage, their faces lit by the dying fires of the fleet they once believed invincible. The sea that had carried Japan's power now cradled its wounded. The cries of men drifted across the waves and then faded into silence. For many, the war that had begun with triumph at Pearl Harbor ended here, beneath the same Pacific sky. When dawn broke on June 5th, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the full reports. 4 carriers lost: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. More than 3,000 men missing or dead. The cream of Japan's naval aviators, those who had trained for years to perfection, were gone. Yamamoto stood motionless in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato. He knew the magnitude of the disaster. For the first time, he considered withdrawing from the operation entirely. The dream of striking the United States a final blow had vanished overnight. In his diary, an officer later wrote that Yamamoto's expression was calm, but his eyes no longer shone. The remnants of the Japanese fleet turned west, retreating under the cover of clouds. Destroyers searched the waters for survivors, pulling aboard those who had endured the night. Many were burned, injured, or silent with shock. Some refused to be rescued, choosing instead to remain at sea beside their lost ships. The discipline that had defined the Imperial Navy persisted even in defeat. Officers saluted their fallen vessels as they slipped beneath the waves, the Imperial flag sinking with them. Across the Pacific, the American task force assessed its own damage. The carrier Yorktown, heavily struck by Japanese bombers, finally sank 2 days later after a submarine attack. But the Americans knew they had achieved something far greater than a tactical victory. They had broken the myth of Japan's invincibility. The tide of war had turned. Midway marked not only the loss of ships and men for Japan, but the loss of initiative. From that moment forward, the United States would seize control of the Pacific and never relinquish it. In Tokyo, the news was delivered with restraint. Official statements described the battle as a draw, concealing the full scale of the losses. Yet those within the naval command understood what had happened. The empire's expansion had reached its limit. The Japanese people were told their sons had fought bravely, that their sacrifice had brought honor to the nation. But privately, leaders of the Navy gathered in silence. They knew rebuilding 4 carriers and retraining their elite aviators would take years they did not have. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The human cost was immense. For the families of the pilots and sailors, telegrams arrived weeks later with the same brief message. Fell in battle for the Emperor. No details, no location, only the finality of war. Many of the men who had survived Pearl Harbor perished at Midway. The stories of their courage and loyalty were passed quietly among veterans. For them, it was not only a defeat of arms, but a loss of faith. The realization that skill and devotion could not overcome fate and the growing power of the enemy. Admiral Yamamoto continued to lead the Navy for another year, but he was haunted by Midway. He blamed himself for the overconfidence that had led to disaster. In 1943, during an inspection tour, his aircraft was shot down by American fighters after his itinerary was intercepted. A grim echo of the intelligence failures that had doomed him at Midway. His death symbolized the end of the generation that had once dreamed of empire across the Pacific. Years later, survivors of both sides would speak of the battle with respect. American veterans often said their victory was as much luck as skill. Japanese survivors remembered their fallen comrades with quiet pride, honoring the discipline and resolve that never faltered even as the sea burned around them. The ocean between them remained vast, but the memories of those days bound them forever in history. The Battle of Midway lasted just 4 days, yet it changed the course of the Second World War. Japan's fleet never fully recovered. From that point on, it fought a defensive war, pushed slowly back across the Pacific. The once mighty carriers of the Imperial Navy lay silent on the ocean floor, monuments to both ambition and courage. The calm that followed was not peace, but exhaustion, the heavy stillness that comes after the storm. The Pacific today lies quiet above the graves of those who fought there. The waters over Midway shimmer in sunlight, hiding the wrecks of ships that once decided the fate of nations. For the men who served, it was not merely a battle of fleets, but a confrontation between destiny and endurance. The Empire of Japan had sought to shape history with one decisive strike, but history had chosen a different path. In the silence of the Pacific, beneath the waves that swallowed their pride and their pain, rests the memory of a moment when the world turned and the ocean kept its secret.